Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and if you've never been here before, well, thanks for checking it out. You're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube page, and it's just a cozy little corner of the internet for narrative. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to read old folklore and fairy tales over some soft music. And specifically, we're going to read some stuff from a German collection. If you are not watching this live and you want to get right to the stories, down in the description below there will be timestamps that you can jump ahead to those. Whatever story you're most interested in. We are kind of doing 2 mini episodes here, so the topic shifts in the middle. And then if you are watching live, though, there is a live chat, who is growing a little crop of potatoes just at the moment. And you're welcome to join in and talk about the stories as we go through them. And I see that Jum Store, GS, Uncle Kitty, and Hira are here. Hira says, I popped in to say that we're back from camping, but my mother is too tired, so she said she'll be missing out on the stream tonight. Even told her she could just have it on as background noise, but no, that's okay. That's quite tired. Jumpstore says, hey guys, I had an eye exam today. Ooh, is that the one where they put the little puff of air in your eye that they tell you not to blink and then do the worst thing in the world? But I don't need subtitles to watch Rory streams. Indeed, I can't afford them, even if I needed them. Well, the subtitles are kind of I put the text up for that reason. And GS says, oh, I hate those eye drops they use. Oh, yeah, that's right. All right. I'm on a slightly new table. So it's surprising how much little changes throw you off here. I'm still trying to figure out if this angle is working. What are we doing tonight? Well, now and then, Uncle Katie said they don't give you the puff of air anymore, Rory. Really? Has it been that long since I've been there? I guess it's probably been about 10 years. Right. So, when I read these collections, I try to find stories that will occupy around anywhere from like 30 minutes to an hour on a topic. But some stuff doesn't really produce enough content to make a whole episode out of. Like, it might be a really interesting thing, but it's like 8 minutes of reading. So in those cases, I mostly have just sort of left aside those little scraps of folklore, and mostly it's urban legends, actually, that tend to be very short but interesting. Anyways, the idea then of tonight's episode is 2 topics that I've looked at a couple of times, but I just couldn't find enough to make a whole episode out of. So we're going to do them as 2 mini episodes in one. And the first one is about the Mountain Monk, which is a spirit of mines that helps miners mine in various ways. Sometimes is a threatening force, sometimes helpful, sometimes both. And then after that, we're going to talk about a couple of records of paganism in folklore and urban legends and so on. Some of it might be real. Some of it is just sort of abstracted from very little evidence. Nonetheless, still falls into that sort of folklore because it's not really a historical analysis. They are tales that are supposedly about the pagan activities of certain areas of Germany. Hira says, 10 years, your poor eyes, Rory. I don't have a lot of reason to go to an eye doctor, is part of it. I can't remember what it was, but at one point an eye doctor said I had better than perfect vision, and I don't know what that means. But yeah, I've never really had any trouble seeing in any state. Jumpstore says, I'm typing with a pencil eraser with my phone pushed away as far as possible. Wow, that's wild. Yeah, I haven't been there for the eye drops. Okay. Chum Store says, I think autocorrect's doing a lot of heavy lifting for me tonight. You know, it's always doing a lot of heavy lifting for me. You'd think me being a writer would, like, make me good at that, but I'm just not. Just checking our settings here. Okay. All right. Lizzie Rose, hello. It's been a little while since I've seen you. Well, seen you in the chat. Seeing text in the chat next to your name. Okay. Our first tale tonight, for the first half of this episode, concerns the Mountain Monk. And we're going to see a couple of little snippets here about the Mountain Monk. It's probably better for me to just read them and then we can discuss about what we even think it is, because it is one of those things where it has quite a bit of variety in how it can be interpreted. Or portrayed, rather. Anyhow, our first tale of the night is called The Mountain Monk in Sankt, Andreasberg. And it comes to us from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, a collection of translations by Jürgen Hubert, who you can support at his Patreon, which will be pinned in the comments below, called Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles. The Bergmunch, or Mountain Monk, is known in Sankt Andreasberg as well. He was a real monk and wanted to establish the mines, but he failed to do so. He started to build the Rieberger Graben ditch, which brings all the waters to the mines in Andreasberg, and was close to finishing it, but finally went bankrupt. After his death, his obsession with mining did not let him rest. Thus, he was seen at the Wuscha Grunt Valley, before the Treibholz forest, and at the Dambach stream, and at the Samson pit, which is perhaps the deepest shaft on Earth, or at least when the story was put together. But everywhere he went, the miners later found ore. Thanks to these discoveries, the mines of Andreasberg were founded, which are the richest in the entire Harz mountain. The Mountain Monk was a count by birth, and when he was seen as a ghost, he wore a miner's waistcoat, a rear leather, and a lamp. The lamp never went out, even if the wind was blowing so strongly that it ripped out the trees. Once, the Mountain Monk approached a bird catcher in the Sperlata Valley at night with his lamp. The bird catcher thought that he was a miner and said, "Can you give me some tallow? As you can see, my light is about to go out." And then the Mountain Monk gave him some tallow from his pit lamp, and this burned for a day and a night, and then it was found to be pure silver. One Sunday, the Mountain Monk appeared in miner's clothing to an artisan's apprentice, who was waiting for his senior artisan. The boy believed him to be his boss, and thus followed him into the mine until his tallow light had been used up, and then the miner put a piece of calcite in his lamp, and then it burned again. And the miner did not speak, but they spotted a lot of ore while they were in the mine together, and after some time they once again reached the spot from which they'd started their trip, and then the miner vanished. But it turns out to be the case that the apprentice had followed him for 30 years. None of the people he'd worked with were still around, and the house in which he'd lived was inhabited by strangers. But his light burned without end until he sold it to someone else at one point, and then it no longer burned. And when the buyer returned to the apprentice, it did not burn for him either. Jumpstore says, tallow that turned into silver. When did this become the Wild Hunt? I think tallow to silver is probably better than what the Wild Hunt was doing. It was in the year 1849 when the mountain monk was last seen. Back then, Andreasberg's mine was supposed to be shut down, or at least be operated with far fewer people. Then the mountain monk showed himself in Vashgrund and walked until the Matthias Schmidt mountain, which is where the seam of Andreasberg leads to. This took place over the course of 4 weeks, and many people went there in the evening between 9 and 11 o'clock in order to see him. And since there has been ore in the mine again, and the pit is back in full business. I think the things that really sort of stand out to me about these tales, this is not the only tales about them. They take a lot of different versions, but is it's hard to understand like why this story exists, or maybe more, why did it persist? And it's, I guess, speaks to sort of just the oddity of it and also the sincerity of it. Like, for us, they aren't real stories. These are, silly little stories told around a fire. But stuff like this, my buddy saw up in the mountains one day this guy, and it went on for a couple of months and whatever else. That's kind of, it's that kind of tale. It's not a tale told for, like, great reasons or whatever else. Jumpstore says, I don't know, even if it started off as dog crap, gold is gold. Yeah, I know. Like, why am I not being handed things by spirits and fae that turn into gold? All right, carrying on. For some very divergent versions of this mountain monk. Our next tale also comes to us from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, translations by Jürgen Hubert, who you can support at the Patreon pin down below, and it is called The Mountain Spirit, and it carries on with this cycle about a monk in the mountains, but it paints a very different picture of him. The Mountain Spirit, Meister Hammerling, commonly called Mountain Monk, occasionally shows himself in the depths, usually as a giant with the black robes of a monk. So this time he's a giant. He often appeared in a mine in the Graubünden Alps, and on Fridays he was especially busy pouring the excavated ore from one bucket to another. The owner of the mine was not inclined to get upset over this, but he was also never insulted by the mountain spirit. However, when a worker who had been annoyed by this pointless back and forth insulted and cursed the spirit, the latter grabbed him with such great force that, while he did not die, his face twisted around. I think they're saying his face went to the back of his head, but maybe I'm misinterpreting that. In Anneberg, within the cave called Rosenkranz, or Rosary, he breathed on 12 miners during their work shift. Because of this, they were immediately lying dead on the ground, and despite its plentiful silver ore, the mine was not extended further. At this site, he appears in the shape of a horse with a long neck and dreadful, glaring eyes on his forehead. Now, it's easy for me, it's a thing, I'll carry on with the story in a second, but it is a thing that the various stale airs and stuff that you can accumulate in any kind of low space caverns, stuff like that. Everything from like hydrogen sulfide to carbon monoxide to things like that can pool there, have often been the source of mythology. The concept of Avernus in Greek times was, that was a pit lake, basically a poison lake. But there was another cave that was supposed to be dedicated to a goddess of death, I think it was, or maybe it was Hades. Fractured memories here, but it was the same thing. It was if you went into the cave entrance, you'd fall over and die. And of course it is because of various stale air and contaminated air and no air circulation. So it's not surprising to me that there's mythology around miners all being found dead. But in Schneeberg, he appeared as a black monk in the St. Georgen pit. He grabbed a miner and lifted him up from the ground, and in the upper reaches of the mine, which used to be very rich in silver, he put him down with such force that his limbs were injured. In the Harz mountains, he once punished an evil foreman who abused the miners. For when the foreman returned to the surface, the mountain monk, who was invisible to the foreman, stood above the entrance to the pit, and when the foreman emerged, the spirit squeezed his head with his knees. You never know what these things will say next. You're like, is he going to toss a rock on his head? Maybe he'll curse him, scare him, something like... No. He's going to squeeze his head with his knees. Jumpstora says this is why you always bring a canary with you. Yeah. Even still, though, like... Canaries will fall... are much more sensitive to the stale air. But even then... You don't really have a lot of recourse if a little bubble of air moves your way. I know this because it used to be a part of my job to know about confined spaces. If you're wondering why I'm making noises, my knees are being very old today. All right. The third story and the last story about the mountain monk before we'll talk a little bit about some pagan accounts, and again, not historical accounts per se, but like folkloric accounts. We're going to, one more tale here about the mountain monk. This one is probably the most story-ish. The other ones being mostly just accounts. The last story about the mountain monks, before we move on to another topic, is called The Mountain Monk in the Harz Mountains, and it is from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, translations by Jürgen Hubert, who you can support at his Patreon pinned in the comments below. Two miners always worked together. Once, when they had ventured down into the mine, and to their assigned site, they noticed that they did not have enough oil in their lamps to last for an entire shift. "What shall we do?" they spoke to each other. "If the oil runs out, so that we have to go back to the surface in the dark, then we will surely have misfortune, for the shaft is quite dangerous. But if we return right now in order to fetch oil from home, then the foreman will punish us, and with relish, for he does not like us." And as they stood there in worry, they saw that a light was approaching them in the far distance of the tunnel. Initially, they were joyous, but when it came closer, they became frightened. For a massive, giant-sized man who was bending over deeply came up the tunnel. He had a large cap on his head. He was also dressed like a monk in other ways, but in his hand he carried a massive pit lamp. And when he had reached the two miners, who were paralyzed in their fright, he rose up and spoke, "Do not be afraid. I do not wish to harm you, and help you instead." He took their lamp and poured oil from his lamp into it. But then he grabbed their tools and did more work for them in 1 hour than they themselves would have been able to do within a week, even with the utmost effort. And now he spoke, "Never tell anyone that you have seen me." And finally he struck the wall on the left with his fist, and the wall opened up, and the miners saw a long gallery which was shimmering with gold and silver. And because the unexpected glare blinded their eyes, they turned away. But when they looked back again, everything had vanished. If they'd thrown their hatchets or another of their tools into it, the tunnel would have remained open, and they would have received much wealth and honor from it. But it was over when they had turned their eyes from it. Nevertheless, they still had the oil of the mountain spirit for their mining work, which did not diminish, and thus it was still a great boon. Is it? However, one Saturday evening many years later, when they once were drinking with good friends in the pub, and... pardon me... and had a merry time, they told the entire story. And on Monday morning, when they went down in the mine, there was no longer any oil in the lamp. Thus, they once again had to fill up fresh oil every time, like everyone else. Oh, hello, Zombie Wolf. It's good to see you. Zombie Wolf says, "Dang, they found the full-service ghost." Lizzie Rose says, "Pit lamp, like a lantern?" Yeah, it's like a mining pit. Like a lamp you would carry into a mining pit. Zombie Wolf says, "How's the stream?" Terrible. One of the worst I've ever done. All right. Let's talk briefly for a moment about paganism in history before I read you the next section. So we're sort of doing our glued together too many episodes. This is the other mini episode. So just going to say some things because pagan is a word that isn't going to make a ton of sense for some of the stuff that are going to read. So I need to give it a bit more of a frame. If you want to get a tea or something, now's the moment. So neo-paganism, which is how a lot of people tend to encounter pagan ideas. Neo-paganism has a bit of a romantic view of what a pagan was in history. I'm not questioning at all what it is now, but I wouldn't go so far as to say it's wrong, but it is, if you're looking at it from a historical perspective, it is a bit incomplete if you're going to take it to be a reflection of historical realities around them. To put it one way, as a music historian whose name I have forgotten puts it, Rome was pagan. The implication there is that Rome, an authoritarian, imperialist, fascist regime, certainly doesn't fit the image of dancing in a forest in harmony with nature that a lot of us might associate modern neo-paganism to. In very broad terms, though, paganism as a word refers to belief systems that are tied to natural cycles, like seasons, moon phases, day cycles, and so on. And I think without exception is polytheistic, but anytime you say without exception about the broad scope of history, there's probably exceptions. So maybe I shouldn't say that. But anyways, the main insight, though, that I want you folks to take away before we read these stories is one that I think I have to offer if you, like most people in the chat, have grown up either exclusively or primarily around Jewish, Christian, or Islamic belief structures. And they have, those express a different kind of relationship between a person and a god than historically a pagan society might have. Now, there are a long list of caveats and exceptions, but in general, a lot of pagan belief systems treated gods as kind of lords over a conceptual territory of life. So if you wanted something from that domain of that god, you would appease that god who looked over it, rather than, say, following a god because it somehow reflected your own morality. You appeased a god who was in charge of that area. You might not even like that god, right? That's not the point. The simplest version of this that I think most of us have seen some version of is you would offer some sort of sacrifice or ritual, really more accurately a tribute to, let's say, a harvest god. And what you're asking for there is that they will give you a good harvest, right? Or you might offer, to give some broader examples, you might offer a ritual or a sacrifice to a god of war if you were a soldier marching to war, which is, by the way, really how you should look at the story of Constantinople, if you want to go back and look at it. That's the context he was coming from. Now, that doesn't mean you were a follower of that god, of Thor or whatever else. It just meant that you accepted that they had power over this area of life where you wanted to find success. So a good deal of paganism in history was this kind of transactional relationship based on the premise of a superior power as opposed to a shared moral conviction. So any given house might regularly engage in rituals to rival gods and other things we wouldn't expect. And some of that we are going to read here. Some of what we're going to read here are Christians giving an account of that relationship between pagans and their gods in specific regions. In other words, people not primed to understand what they were seeing and who started from a stance of frankly hostility to the rituals they were witnessing. And also that some of these tales of pagan rituals may not have actually even been anything to do with paganism. They may not have even ever actually happened, to be honest, because they're folklore. I guess the overall point is some of what you're going to hear makes more sense if you understand that kind of relationship to a god. And the sources here on these stories are primarily Christians. Christians in a very narrow sense, too. We're talking about Christians who did not have internet, did not have libraries. They went to their one church. They were not primed to understand the complexities they were going to witness or hear about from other people in that town. I just wanted to say that up front because when I was reading these stories, they made sense to me, but I realized that if you came at it from the perspective that a town had a god the way that, later Rome had, the Holy Roman Empire had like a Christian god, it's a different kind of description, a different kind of relationship being established here. And I'm not sure that the authors of these snippets understood that, but you can understand that now. And it will help you understand it. Keep saying understand, Rory. You're a writer. There's no other word for it. Jumpstore says, I love the idea that in a few thousand years, people of the future will look at our fantasy literature and think we were battling dragons and riding unicorns. I do like that idea. Although we don't really have much reason to believe that a lot of pagan beliefs were insincere. There's a lot of obvious sincere ritual evidence. Zombie Wolf says, au contraire, the cult of Bacchus was very popular in ancient Rome. Indeed, it was. Oh, that's right, Zombie Wolf, you're a baker. Oof. But anyways, okay, so. That's all I really wanted to say. It's also to establish that pagan as a concept is very, very broad. Very broad. When somebody says pagan, in most contexts, we're talking about everything from like Rome all the way over to, they would probably call a lot of Japanese belief systems pagan as well, even though I don't think that's entirely fair. It's broad. That's enough. Is that enough? We're going to carry on in. I will also say that pagan, part of that neo-pagan movement, the worst parts of it are a bunch of people up to, let's say, suspect things that have nothing to do with history, spirituality. They're all a bunch of nationalist weirdos who are trying to thinly veil what they really are. So be cautious of that kind of stuff. If you want to look into this stuff more, just know that it got infected with that nonsense around the 19th and 20th century as well. Lizzie Rosa says, as someone who grew up Catholic and now considers herself pagan, I think you explained that pagan stuff very well, Rory. Well, thank you very much, Lizzie. I definitely didn't want to do anyone any disservice. Okay. With that said, let's look at some Christians trying to make an account of paganism in some regions. Yeah, Zombie Wolf says the ancient Romans just called any culture that wasn't Roman barbaric. That is accurate. It's a good thing we left that behind. That's a joke. We didn't. Okay. Our next tale is called Rhetra. Rhetra is a tale about paganism, supposedly. It's more a folklore account from a region of Germany. It comes to us translated by Jürgen Hubert in his collection Sunken Castles, Evil Boodles. In the province of Rhetra of the Rheterians, in the modern day Strelitz, there was once a city where Pruvitz and Talenza is located, named Radigast or Radigast. By the way, I don't know if this has anything to do with the Lord of the Rings Radigast. I assume not. I can see no similarity. The author has confused the name of the city with that of the main idol. This is a note from the, not Jürgen, the note of this original snippet. Radigast, the author has confused the name of the city with that of the main idol, which had its temple in it. The city was built as a triangle, which had 3 gates, one at each corner. It was surrounded by a forest which was considered to be highly sacred by the inhabitants, and no wood was cut there. 2 gates were open to normal traffic. The 3rd gate in the direction of the morning was the smallest. The road starting there led to the sea, which had a frightening view. The gate was not easy to open. Near this gate there was a heathen temple, which was artificially built out of wood. The pillars had the shape of horns of different animals, and from the outside the walls were decorated with the strangely carved images of the gods and goddesses, so that everyone could inspect them. On the inside, the handmade gods stood with terrible countenance, clad with helmets and armor, and at each the name was engraved. The name of their foremost deity was, gonna try this, Zuarashitchi, the all-potent Radigast, who is venerated above all others and prayed to by all heathens. Their flags were never removed unless necessary for a military campaign, in which case they were taken by their warriors who fought on their feet. The inhabitants had dedicated priests who carefully stored these flags. The who fought on their feet, I assume, means that they didn't ride horses, is what they're trying to clarify there. Maybe there's something else to that clarification. They alone had the duty to sacrifice to their gods and to placate them when they were angry. Only these priests were allowed to sit while everyone else was standing. Yeah, Gem Store. I'm sure YouTube's going to think I swore. Remember to like the video, because I'll get buried for it. Whenever they had doubts on how to proceed, they dug deeply into the ground while chanting secret incantations in order to gain a judgment via divination. Whenever they had finished this task, they covered this opening with a green lawn. Then they led a horse, which was honored and worshipped above all the other animals by them, between 2 spears which had been stuck in the ground with their tips and touched at each other at the other end while praying devoutly. After this, they divined the question they wanted to ascertain. In this, they closely observed the movement of the horse as if it was a divine prophet. If there was a good omen for either course of action, the original plan was pursued, and if there was no omen for either, the people were sad, and the endeavor was cancelled entirely. Helmold describes Rhetra in his chronicle in the following way. The most heavily visited city of the Rhetorians was Rhetra, the center of idol worship. There was a great temple dedicated to the idols, among whom Radigast was preeminent. His image was covered with gold, and his pedestal was covered with purple cloth. The city itself had 9 gates and was located at a deep lake. A wooden bridge allowed passage, but only for those who wanted to sacrifice or consult the oracle. No, I'll say that out loud. Zombie Wolf says, did you just say their Tips touch, Rory? It's the same thought I had when I read it. Okay. Carrying on. This is the short one, right? Yes. Our next tale is a very short one called The Crown of Radigast. It also comes to us from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles. One of the remaining traces of the idol Radigast is a window frame in the church at Gadabush, which is located inside the tower above the door. The legend states that this is the crown of Radigast. The window frame has the form of a wheel and is made out of iron, which allegedly has a high silver content. The Schwerin Cathedral has a similar iron wood frame. Windows of this form are called Rosa Orientalis, or Rose of the Orient. And I don't normally, because it is copyrighted, read much of the commentary. Jumpstore says, I thought you said this was the Christian version, right? But I will read this first line here that I think explains sort of the angle you should be looking at these stories in, which is from Jürgen Hubert's commentary. He says, while this is absolutely no evidence of old pagan worship, it does showcase how older stories and even misunderstandings can metastasize and take a life of their own in order to explain unusual objects or phenomenon in the world surrounding the narrator. And I think that's a really good observation, because notably here, you know, what folklore often is a person sees something in their world, in their life, and then they try to make sense of it, or they make a tale out of it just for fun, or whatever it is that their motivation. Maybe they just want to entertain the neighbors, or maybe they were trying to sell them something and it just became a story over time. They didn't realize it was just a con. Like, there's lots of ways that these stories come about. But this tale, this snippet, looks at an iron window and goes, nah, that's Radigast. And there just is not much evidence that that is what it was, right? So that's why I say you should take these things. Jürgen says the same thing in his in his intro here, but you should take this all with grains of salt. This is a bunch of Christians looking at stuff and then going, oh, that must have been the pagans. Okay. This is a cool story. I like this story for several reasons that I'll talk about afterwards. But it is definitely the most unique. Our next tale is called The Venus Mountain near Uffhausen. And it comes to us from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, translations by Jürgen Hubert. The Schneeberg is a castle in Schönberg, near Schönberg Mountain near Uffhausen, which lies about 1 hour away from Freiburg. In old times, a knight lived there who committed many and great crimes over the years and wasted his days and nights in excess and pursuit of sins. We've talked about before the fact that most knights in folklore are terrible people, and the knight in shining armor thing does not come up often. Anyhow, carrying on. Finally, his conscience woke up from these fantasies, and he resolved to lead a different way of life. But since no local priest was willing to absolve him from his sins, he made a pilgrimage to Rome so that he could receive absolution from the Pope himself. But this too was in vain. Instead, the Pope was so aghast after hearing the knight's confession that he told him, "It is more likely that the staff I am holding in my hand will sprout roses than that your sins will find forgiveness before God." And in despair, the knight embarked on the long path across the Alps towards his home. But when he rode up that valley towards his castle, he saw an open entrance to the mountain at his side. And inside, the goddess Venus held her opulent court. Beguiling music and sweet songs wafted out towards him. And leered his despairing heart with irresistible force. And thus, in order to forget his pain, he raced into the depths of the mountain with his horse. It was 2 years later, the Pope's staff, the same which he had held in his hands in the presence of that knight, started to green and sprout roses. It was then the Holy Father remembered the already forgotten sinner. Immediately the Pope had a report sent to the knight's widows still living on the Schneeberg. The poor woman immediately had people dig into the Venus mountain, and indeed they found the knight in the depths of the cave which forms the entrance to the court of Venus, but he was dead, still straddling his horse. And then there's a note here from the original collector that I will also read because it gives a variant account of this. The legend of the Venus mountain can be encountered in the Upper Rhine Valley, in addition to Thuringia. The beautiful natural landscape and the mild climate encourage outdoor celebrations in the open air, and many knights, such as Tannhauser, who were warned in vain by the faithful Eckhart, I think we've done some Tannhauser stuff, might have vanished during such merry celebrations near the outskirts of the forest. Then it was usually claimed that Venus and her entourage had lured him into the depths of the mountain, and while dances and games and all sorts of festivals were celebrated in crystal halls, the return to the surface world was forbidden for all time. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I like that story. First of all, I find it fascinating when pagan gods, openly named like Venus, are featured in a story that also openly believes in the existence of the Christian God. Because I don't know, I guess my writer brain is like, what would that world be? And then the other thing that I liked about it, that really sort of stands out for me, is this idea, this very non-Christian idea that somehow he's managed to do things that would not be forgiven by God. You know, when that's the whole shtick, right? Hira says, my mom texted me 38 minutes ago saying she is listening, so I guess I should correct the record before she smacked me the next time I see her. I give you a pass. Should she reach to smack you, you can say, Rory has granted me immunity. Okay, we have one more. This one is mostly just informational, I guess. It's not the most fun one to end on. There is actually another story here that's only very, very thinly connected to anything that I could read, I guess. I don't know. We'll see how warm it's getting. It's pretty warm right now. Our next tale is called the Old Franconian Idol Lollus. And it comes to us from Sunken Castle's Evil Poodles, translations by Jürgen Hubert, who you can support at the pinned comment below. He has a Patreon. It's still possible to read about an alleged heathen idol whose type and name are unique to Franconia. This one is called Lollus, Lelus, or Lulos, whose particular center of worship is said to have taken in the region surrounding the River Main near the modern-day city of Schweinfurt. The iconic image of the idol was found in the shape of a male youth with curly golden hair. There was a garland of poppy flowers hanging around his neck and over his chest. And don't think that at this time people didn't know how to use poppies. With the right hand of the figure reached for his mouth and grasped the tongue with his thumb and index finger. With the left hand, he held a goblet of wine which contained ears of grain. Apart from a loincloth, the figure was entirely nude. The idol stood in a sacred, fenced-off grove close to the shores of the Main, and the local people brought grapes and grain ears as a sacrifice at certain times. Even today, a location at this wine-blessed side of the Main is called Lula or Lala, roughly. I'm not doing a great job pronouncing that. It is said that Lollus was worshipped in Franconia at the same time as Diana. I'll let chat fill in that blank, but Diana being a very famous goddess, whose holy temple was allegedly on the Frauenberg in Würzburg until the arrival of St. Kilian, the apostle of the Franconians. The only source about this Lollus, from which all later authors who wrote about him drew, is the 3-volume work of a physician, who I'm not going to read the name of. And nobody knows where the statue of the alleged idol came from, nor when, how, and where it was discovered. Hey, do you want me to tack on a story about a lake full of corpses? Maybe to give us a more stylish finish. GS says, yeah. Jumpstore says, can you really sacrifice grapes or grain ears? Isn't it more of an offering? Do you have to slice every grape open like you would sacrifice an animal, or do the grain ears struggle at the altar? You know, I think actually you're highlighting, I think, a good point about like what it is to be an outsider and viewing a ritual, right? To them, they're like, well, I guess they're making a sacrifice, but whether all of that was seen as like a sacrifice of the thing, or whether it was seen as just a ritual of acknowledgement, because there is, not always, but there is a lot of like hay given to the idea that gods also just want attention. So sometimes it isn't even about giving them things of value. It's just, hey, look, I remember you exist, and thanks for the grain. Jumpstore says encore. Okay. What made me think of this was twofold. I knew that I could hyperlink to it at the bottom of this, but I'd mentioned in that one story that knights were terrible people in folklore, and I was like, actually, this is an excellent example of that. If I drop that, then this is a good way to show you what I mean. This is more the norm, frankly. When you hear about heroes that would fit the knight in shining armor trope in folklore, it very often is not an actual prince, or if it is a prince, it's a prince who's like a very young kid who couldn't have done any wrong and gets wandering off and whatever. But it's actually usually like a rags to riches story where a kid who is braver than the actual nobility. And this is a good example of actually a real thing. Jurgen talks about this in the footnotes of it, but if you know anything about the history of knights, you'll also know this is a real thing. There's nothing about this that is hard to believe, other than maybe the supernatural elements, which is what Jurgen says in his comments here, but I agree. There is no reason to doubt this because we have evidence that this is 100% a thing that knights did. Not all of them, but enough to be a problem. Jumpster says gods, humans worship us, Rory reassuring the chat. They just want attention. That's true. When you think about it, though, if your model for authority was kings, them being like petulant narcissists makes sense because that's what a lot of kings were. Uncle Kitty says, now I'm picturing an old man with one eye screaming, love me, damn it, which is an Odin reference there. Probably not far off. I know American Gods makes a lot out of that too. I've not seen the show, but the book. And he's not wrong. Okay. Our bonus story to establish that knights were not well regarded in folklore is called The Corpse Lake. And it also comes to us from Sunken Castle Evil Poodles. Stories from German folklore translated by Jürgen Hubert, who you can support down at the pinned comment below. Not far from the village of Rhetra, which lies about 1.5 miles from Pagan, there is a long, tall hill, and beneath it lies a lake known as the Leichnisse. I don't really have my pronunciation guide for any of this because I didn't plan it, so my apologies to the entire country of Germany. On the hill, which is now overgrown with shrubs, there used to be a bandit's castle, whose remains can be spotted now and then amidst the shrubbery. The whole hill is still called Burgwall, or Castle Wall, and the bandits who lived in the castle threw the corpses of those they slew into the lake, from which the lake derives its name. The murdered and the murderers are said to haunt the lake and its environs in some nights, and nobody likes to visit the area after dark. Another tale gives us more details. The Leichnisse is in the middle of two spots where two castles used to stand, where the villages of Lucknitz and Rommen can still be found now. These two castles belong to a villainous robber knight named Hans von Rommen. The river Rando, which flows through the lake, was traversable by ships in those days, and thus it was common for ships to pass through the lake. The knight and his bandits only waited for those moments, and he had constructed an ingenious contraption which aided him in capturing those ships. They had put down two chains across the lake which were about 50 feet apart, and which were about 2 inches above the water when they were stretched taut. Whenever he saw a ship approaching in the distance, he and his bandits hid in the reeds at the shore of the lake and left the first chain slacken, so that it would be below the surface of the water. But when the ship had passed over it, he pulled it taut again, and thus the ship was stuck between the two chains, and could go neither backwards nor forwards. And he and his bandits swarmed over it, and slaughtered the crew, and took all of its goods. The corpses were thrown into the lake, on the side of the long hill. It frequently occurred that the bandits discovered a larger crew on the ship than they had anticipated, and in these cases they rang a large bell which they'd hung up at the shore for this very purpose. Then reinforcements would arrive from both castles. This bell fell into the lake after the death of the knight, and it remains there. And at noon on St. John's Day, it is still possible to hear its ringing. Gia says, now I want to draw a grape being sacrificed with his little arms and legs. My understanding is that, in general, human sacrifice has not been a very common thing. I mean, obviously the stories of it really persist because it's quite shocking, but as like a general practice, apparently it's not been super common, which makes sense. Animal sacrifice, on the other hand, is definitely was common. Jumpstore says, did you also make your animal crackers beg for their lives as you bit off their limbs, saving the head for last? I just got some animal crackers today. Because I'm a celiac, that's a notable thing. Then found some animal crackers I can eat. Uncle Kitty says Von Ramen. Well, I may be pronouncing it wrong. Let's see what Google says about this. As you know, it's definitely trustworthy. Google Translate. That guy's name was what? Von Ramen. Remember his first name, can't find it.
Von Ramin.
Ramin. Von Ramin. I did wonder about that because the I tends to have a more E sound in my experience with German, which is limited. Jumpstore says, kind of like plane crashes, you hear about them all the time, but they're actually great. Where indeed, because they are so significant in people's memories too. They are... airplanes in flight are some of the most researched and regulated amongst safety people. All right. There you go. A little bit of a corpse lake to cap it off. But it does, honestly, if you really think about what was a knight was a trust fund kid given a bureaucratic job to be something of a tiny tyrant over a neighborhood, mostly collecting taxes and things like that. Like, they really were not at all the way that, like, fairy tales written by the French in the 16th century would have conceived of them. They're like trust fund cops. So the fact that they had this terrible reputation in folklore is not actually all that surprising. Most history that we have that we can trust, basically, paints a picture of knights as being horrible people. And given that a lot of folklore is carried and spoken by people who were without power and money, it's not surprising that they do not remember fondly the many trust fund kids with swords that patrolled their neighborhoods and lands. Sorry to de-romanticize. The last time I said this, by the way, it was one of the first times I got a downvote on a video, and I don't know if it's related. It could just be a misclick or something, but I do think some people really cling to certain ideas about the past and really cannot handle being told otherwise. But knights were rarely heroic, I'm sorry to say. All right. Well, there you go. 2 little mini episodes glued together in one bonus story. Sort of a grab bag. We had the mountain monk. Remember when we were talking about that? Big old monk that would give you oil for your mining, or it might kill you for some reason. And then we looked at some pagan rituals, supposedly, as collected and communicated by people who probably didn't really understand much about it, which makes them interesting. They're an interesting little accounts of a mythology. Jumpstore will tell us about the concert next week. I look forward to hearing it. It is approaching 10 million degrees in this room, so I'm going to go. GS says it's the Rice Krispie Square of folklore. GS also says, all joking aside, must have been a brutal time to live. Yes, indeed. Yes, it was. It was a very interesting time to live. I think I mentioned this before, but I was reading about how, like, one of the expectations of a lord was when wars were happening, big ones, the king would command them to take their soldiers and join him in battle. So a bunch of like princely noble types would join him in battle. And sometimes they all got killed. And, you know, so much chaos goes on, especially when you're in a large nation, that sometimes just no one came back to these feudal keeps. No lord ever returned home. Nobody claimed it, right? And so what would happen, what would form out of those is what we would consider basically anarchist communes of farmers who would just handle themselves, do their own sales, whatever else, and could care less about kings. Also known as my hero, because that sounds awesome. There's also accounts of people who would farm unused land that nobles used to have, and then they would send the knights out to run them away. There's a lot of variety in history as to how these things came together. But yeah, I mean, I'm rambling now. I'm rambling about history. Anyhow, those who are lurking and potentially sunburned, take care of yourself. And for the rest of you folks, I hope your eyes feel better, Jumpstore, or work again. It was good to see you again, Zombie Wolf. Uncle Kitty, GS, Lizzie Rose, thank you for your insights. And Hira, of course. And anybody else out there lurking. It's been great hanging out with you. I'm going to go turn my air conditioning on, aka I'll keep the fire warm. You folks, have yourself a good sleep.
Mm-hmm.